I talked to you last time about the two types of incomplete friendship, the friendship of pleasure and the friendship of utility. So it remains for us now to talk about friendships of virtue. So back to the top of the first page, but the far right-hand corner of that four-page handout. And we need to note, first of all, that when Aristotle calls this a complete or perfect friendship, he doesn't mean that it's a friendship between two perfect individuals. He means that it is a complete friendship. It's a perfect example of what we mean by a friendship, and that is the friendship of two people who are friends they're both good people, and they're friends in order to reinforce and help to grow one another's virtue. So what might that look like? Let me give you an example of myself and then another example that you may relate to more. But let's say that I have a really bad day at work. I end up in conflict with someone. I say to a not so close friend of mine on the phone on the way home, who just asks in passing, how was my day? And I tell them about this conflict, and they say, oof, some people are really idiots. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I get home and I say to my partner, who's also my closest friend, that I've had this incident at work and come into conflict with this person. And I describe it, and in the way that I describe it, it's clear that the other person is the jerk in the situation. That's the person who's misbehaving, and that I have behaved perfectly. Sometimes my partner consoles me that I've had that sort of painful interaction, but occasionally he says to me, Jeffrey, I have bad news for you. You were the jerk in that situation. You're the one who needs to apologize and make some kind of amends. Now, that's a difficult truth to hear. It is painful to hear. And people who are friends of pleasure or friends of utility are not going to raise a point like that with us. But people who are our closer friends, closest especially, whom Aristotle would talk about as complete friends, they will risk creating a little bit of friction, creating some pain between us, because they know that the friendship is not based on pleasure. They know us, they know hopefully that we're good people, and they know that we're good people trying to get better. We want to be better people than we are at this time. And the comment, I think you were the jerk in the situation, that comment is intended to empower me to become a better person, to support my intention to become a better person. I think that's the sort of thing that Aristotle is talking about. You might also think about a friend of yours who's always getting into bad relationships. And your friend comes to you at the end of the most recent breakup and says to you, why does this keep happening to me? These people keep misbehaving. Why are people jerks to me in dating relationships? You might, if it's a close friend, say to the person eventually, look, yeah, those are not such great people, and they are behaving badly toward you, but you might want to have a look at the fact that you keep choosing to date just the wrong kind of person for you. And in fact, it seems like you are compulsively stepping into relationships with people who are going to be bad for you, and you stay probably in these relationships longer than you should, long after the person's bad behavior becomes manifest. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that Aristotle is talking about with friendships of virtue. They're complete or perfect friendships in the sense that they're not deficient in the way that the friendships of utility and the friendships of pleasure are. They're based on the mutual goodness or virtue of the two people who are involved in them. That's their basis. And so it's a friendship of a whole self to a whole self, because that's what's required for virtue. And Aristotle says in this third quotation, where am I? He says in this third quotation that friends are friends unconditionally. And we can think back to the first paragraph of Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals that we read before this, that the goodwill is the only thing that is unconditionally good. Aristotle wants to say, well, here's an unconditional good. Perfect friendship is an unconditional good. Friendships of pleasure are conditioned on sharing pleasures and continuing to share pleasures and not finding out, ugly truths about someone. Friendships of utility are based on mutual benefit. They're based on that continuing throughout the friendship. But friendships of virtue are not dependent upon pleasure, and they are not dependent on utility. They are founded on the basic goodness of each person, along with, it comes along with being a good person, that you have a desire to get continuously better. The next square is about the speed at which these friendships come about. So remember that friendships of pleasure begin quickly and they can end just as quickly. Same thing with these friendships of mutual benefit that Aristotle calls friendships of utility. They can begin quickly as soon as you notice that you can be of mutual benefit to one another, and they can end quickly the moment the mutual benefit does not continue. In the case of the friendship of virtue, we can notice that another person is virtuous quickly, right? Especially if we're paying close attention. So the desire for a friendship of virtue can happen very quickly. But the friendship itself has to be built stone by stone, like a cathedral or like the Great Wall of China, right? And these friendships, once they're built, turn out to be exceptionally durable. They last for a really long time, and they can last through periods of difficulty. Okay. Second page. The first box we've talked about already. The second box, Aristotle says, time and intimacy are needed. And that means that the friends of virtue need to live together, right? They need to spend a great deal of time together. And of course, not only does Aristotle exist before Zoom, he exists before mail or telephones or telegraphs. And so in order to establish this intimate communication about the most important issues in our lives, two friends of virtue were essentially going to have to live together, at least to live in the same town, probably even the same part of town. Of course, today we may have different ways of spending time together. Electronic media makes it possible for us to communicate instantaneously across very large distances. And that's what allows this stone-by-stone building to take place. And I just want to note, that's one point that is in common between the friendship of virtue and the friendship of pleasure, is that both of them want to spend large amounts of time together. Next, the friendship of virtue is immune to slander. So you have two people who are very close friends. They're both very good people. They know that they're good people. And somebody says something bad about one of them to the other. What is the typical response? To say, oh, okay, I'll end that friendship. No, partly because the friendship is so close and the two people know one another so well. Often, the one person will be absolutely certain that the other person cannot have said that or cannot have done that because it's completely out of keeping with their fundamental personality and their way of life. Now, of course, we can make mistakes about that, but Aristotle is not claiming that we're infallible about that. He just claims that these friendships of virtue, of the three types of friendship, are the least vulnerable to gossip, essentially. And likewise, with a sense of injustice, right? Maybe an injustice has occurred, we tend to give our partner in a friendship of virtue the benefit of the doubt. When we think that an injustice may have occurred, we either sort of let it go and assume they didn't intend it that way, or we have a talk with them and we say, I feel like this aspect of our interactions is getting a little bit out of balance. Can we please bring it back into balance? Neither of which typically happen in the two incomplete types of friendship. Okay. And the next box just says, friendships of virtue are friendships in the full sense and why that's the case. Next box, complete friendship is the friendship of good people who are alike in virtue. And this is different from both the friendship of pleasure and the friendship of utility, because in both of those, bad people can be friends with bad people can be friends with good people, so the character, moral character just doesn't matter. But two bad people, two vicious people, two people who are not that good and don't necessarily want to get better, cannot be friends of virtue, because that goodness is what the friendship is based upon. And in the next video, we're going to find out something important that becomes the basis of that fact. Likewise, the friends of virtue are both pleasant to one another and useful to one another, right? And so friendships of virtue don't exclude the friendship of pleasure. They don't exclude the friendship of utility. The friendship of virtue includes pleasure. It includes virtue. It includes pleasure. It includes usefulness, mutual benefit, but it does not depend upon either one of those. So it's not conditioned on that, the point I made earlier. So what does that mean exactly? Well, let me give you an example. You could have a very close friend and they have a fantastic sense of humor, and they're also constantly helping you with, physical things that you need help with. Let's say, God forbid, that they go through a period of illness, right? Mental or physical illness. And it becomes impossible or very difficult for them to be in a good mood, let's say, and therefore manifest their great sense of humor, and or it becomes very difficult because they're ill to help you, to be mutually beneficial to you, let's say when you're moving furniture, making a big meal for friends, something like that. Does the friendship continue through that period of difficulty? If it does, you have to suspect that it's a friendship of virtue rather than a friendship of pleasure or a friendship of utility. Why? Because it can survive periods when the friendship is not pleasurable. It's usually pleasurable, but it can get through the difficult periods. And likewise, it's mutually beneficial, but it can get through those difficult periods. And finally, on this friendship of virtue, we can only have a few friendships of virtue in our entire lives. There's a couple of reasons for that. One you already have, and that is that takes a long time to build and a lot of energy and time to sustain a friendship of virtue. You're not going to have time for very many of those in your lives. Some people may have none, right? The other aspect, though, and Aristotle mentions this in the first quotation in the very last box, that truly virtuous people and people who are good and trying to get even better than they already are, those people are rare. There are not that many genuinely good people in the world. And maybe Aristotle is a little too pessimistic about this. You might disagree with him. You may have had a different experience of life. But Aristotle does think that it's going to be hard to find good people. And in fact, maybe we ourselves are not quite good enough yet to have a friendship of virtue. And so we're not going to have large numbers of these in the course of our lives. And again, that's a contrast with the friendship of pleasure and the friendship of utility. So again, think of these three interlocking circles, right? Three overlapping circles. They overlap in the center. There are similarities of each to the other, and there are differences of each to the others. But the one that is complete, the one that's perfect, is the friendship of virtue, and that's the one that Aristotle wishes for us most of all. I just want to emphasize that when I say that the friendship of pleasure is incomplete and the friendship of utility is incomplete, and even when I say that each of those is defective in certain ways, Aristotle is not making a moral judgment on friendships of pleasure. Friendships of pleasure contribute to our lives. Friendships of pleasure are good. They're just not the highest kind of pleasure that we can have. Friendships of utility are good and necessary, right? It's not good for us to live alone, and it's very difficult and probably impossible for a human being to take care of all of her needs without the help of others. So friendships of utility are good. They're just not the highest kind of friendship, the one that Aristotle wishes for us most of all. But even the friend of virtue is probably going to need quite a number of friendships of utility and friendships of pleasure in order to make a complete life. So you could say that the friendships of pleasure and the friendship of utility are a foundation that supports the possibility of a friendship of virtue. They become a condition of the possibility of it. There's one more condition of the possibility of virtuous friendship that we need to talk about, and I'll talk about that at the beginning of the next video.